Hi all, I have a very instructive game from an opening perspective today. So you might want to play the Sicilian defence with black and have something against some of the sidelines which are very often played, especially if you're in the UK. British players love their anti-Sicilians or pet lines or alternatives. Now here today we're going to look at a game Rauf Mamedov against Judit Polgar, arguably one of the greatest women's chess players in the history of the game. So e4, Judit plays the Sicilian defence. She showed great fighting spirit, dynamic, aggressive play throughout her career. c3, the opponent clearly wants to bore her to death with the move c3. So what does she play? Well, she actually plays d5. This is a logical reply. It is the recommendation of that free short and sweet course on the Sicilian. You can see in that link there. I'll speak about that later. Let's have a look at this game now. E takes, queen takes d5, d4, and we have the move knight c6. So very logical, putting pressure on d4, knight f3, and now bishop g4. Again, a very logical move, pinning the knight, indirectly putting more pressure on d4. Bishop e2, and now Judit saddles white with the isolated queen's pawn. So after c takes d4, you might think, well, the obvious snag here, isn't it worrisome that we've just given the c3 square for a tempo gain on our queen? Well, Judit is not worried. e6, we have that tempo gain, but now we can actually develop a piece with tempo bishop e4. This is arguably a much better idea than queen h5 because the queen will be further harassed after moves like h3, taking your queen's hit. So the queen doesn't really want to go to h5 in a hurry, and in fact here this move, which develops a piece, also pins that knight. White unpins, so determining now where this queen will go is very interesting. Judit actually decides queen a5, which puts pressure on c3. Black plays a very dynamic, aggressive move here, bishop f4, wanting to offer a pawn for fast development and maybe the possibility of d5 later, or very, very quickly after. So black doesn't want to be too materialistic. On the other hand, in this position, the queen is potentially a target to things like knight b5 in particular and bishop c7. This queen could still be embarrassed should black be really worried here. h3 is also a move, but bishop f4 has some tactical points. So what does Judit do here? In fact, she plays the move knight f6 and allows the Rauf the seemingly dangerous knight b5 move. So very interesting situation here indeed. What is black doing here? The immediate threat of bishop c7 is there. We have knight d5 protecting the c7 square and hitting that bishop. If black castled, then bishop c7 is pretty nasty. Say queen a6, knight d6, discovering an attack on the queen, and it's all pretty nasty. The knight's covering b5, and the queen's almost like getting checkmated or just losing material with b5 taking. It looks horrendous. So that's to be a concern as well. So knight d5, not castling. But here, surely the snag, you might think, is that white can now play, as the game, knight d6 check. So this seems to be getting a very important bishop because we have pawns on light squares. Is this really justifiable? Rook d8, trying to nudge the bishop off that f4 square. The bishop is nudged off f4, which black can now make use of. If the bishop returned back, though, to g3, covering f4, then bishop takes, giving white the bishop pair seems a ludicrous idea, but structurally, black, with the two knights and that isolated queen's pawn, has a really fun position to play here. Can easily build up pressure on d4 with a very nice advantage, and even sometimes take d4 like this without too much penalty at all. So we have bishop c5, and black makes use of that kind of soon to make use of that f4, but first b6, bishop drops to a3, cutting the king, so the king's still in the center. Is this a very dangerous way of playing, or is it justified? The king prevented from castling. Well, there's a structural argument here that with the isolated queen's pawn, and now with knight f4, this can guarantee at least simplification or even more structural damage. we have rook c1, knight takes e2, getting rid of white's bishop pair, queen takes, and now the queen sits on a lovely blockading square, putting pressure on f3, with the idea of potentially more structural damage, and also there are things like knight takes d4 on the cards. You might think, hold on a sec, wasn't there knight takes d4 here? Well, with the king, black king in the center, this might be a little bit too much. For example, queen e3, knight takes, g takes, bishop h3, rook c7 is very dangerous, looking at rook e7. And for example, this scenario is pretty unpleasant, where, for example, the piece can be dropped on h3 quite easily in some lines. So much safer than taking on d4, queen d5. Solid positional chess here. We have queen e3, and now taking, inflicting more structural damage on white and getting the queens off. The technical issue of the king not being able to castle is kind of addressed, and the knight with king d7, not allowing any invasion on the dreaded 7th rank. So for example, the materialistic knight takes d4 would guarantee at least a draw for white because of that possibility of rook e7 shack and rook d7 hitting the rook, so that's at least a draw for white. So we have king d7. Judit can be really pleased with this position out of the opening. White has severe structural damage, hasn't got the bishop pair, a lovely blockade square on d5. We have rook c3, and also the black rooks are connected, of course. Hello, hello. Okay, so rook c3. If rook fd1, then king c7, for example, king b7, just unpinning for a while, and now keeping that pressure on. The d pawn can torture the d pawn. It's a beautiful position for black to have there. If instead d5, this is radical but mostly harmless. There's no big compensation here because a6 puts a stop to try and exploit the pin, puts a stop to that fun. And here we can parry the knights being attacked a bit more with this maneuver. So this is all pretty safe stuff. So rook c3. We have knight takes d4 now. Judit dares to take on d4 in this position. Okay, rook e1. Now we have knight b5, forking, check. King goes back to e8. Rook cd3. A pair of rooks come off. f6. Bishop b4. Now knight c7. Rook d6. Now maybe a slight inaccuracy here. A subtlety of this move, it does block the bishop from f8. And so that kind of blind spot here for that moment in time, it seems the engine's really like rook f8 here, giving black a real clear advantage. So this would have been, it seems, the most precise technical move available. So for example, a4, and the rook gets out, and even if this a5 from white, it's not very convincing at all. Black's got a big advantage there. If rook c6, then rook f7, so just in time protecting the knight, getting out of the fire of the bishop. And this is just wonderful stuff for black, holding on to that pawn. In the game, Judit felt, well, I'll just give back that pawn because it's a really comfortable position anyway. So equal on material, but look at white's structural damage. Easier for black to play and for white to slip up still. g5 puts the brakes on f4. Rook d4, we have king e6. The king is more active than the white king. Rook c4, rook d8. Knight takes b4 is pleasant enough for black as well, but keeping some tension in the game gives white more scope to go wrong, as white soon actually is about to. After rook d7, a4, knight e7, bishop e3, knight g6. Here is the moment that white should have played f4. It seems the most accurate move is f4, trying to dissolve the double pawns whilst the rook and bishop support it. So for example here, this should be only a small advantage if anyone's got the advantage for black. But in the game, the blunder king f1, which allows the fork knight e5, hitting the rook and hitting f3. So with this, winning that pawn now, a pawn up again, better structure than white. So how is it possible to consolidate? a5, trying to at least damage the black pawns a bit. So slicing those up, check, and trying to get back a pawn or two. So knight f3, rook takes h7, check. Now if the king goes to g2, then there's rook g1, checkmate. So the king goes to e2, we have rook b1. Black has relentless pressure here in the ending. So again, a pawn up after king d3, rook b5, a solid outside pass pawn up. The knight nicely entrenched on the light square at the moment. Now we have check, driving the king back, a4, the pawn's made a bit of progress. Bishop c5, check, and now rook c4. We have now here king d5, and now this is the end for black after this move. Yes, it was a very bad position anyway. If bishop a3, then check picks up the bishop, but this is basically picking up that bishop after rook e4 check. The king has to go to d2, and after knight f3 check, unveils an attack on that bishop, winning that bishop. So the game ended here. So this game is a very important, I believe, theoretical example showing a few decision points that you might have to make if you want to play against the Alapin's variation. Give white the isolated queen's pawn. You have to be a bit wary. Where is your queen? It's out and about, going to go. I wouldn't recommend going to h5 in the evidence of this game. Go to a5, and there's still nasties that you have to cope with. And this game showed that nasty of knight b5 being coped with very dynamically and aggressively, giving white basically nothing out of the opening. A fantastic position to play against the isolated queen's pawn. So a great structural example from Judit Polgar. Probably there's not many like positional games. It's usually have fierce tactical abilities in games that are demonstrated when people cover Judit's games, but this was a nice positional game here, and a great example for how to play against the Alapin's variation, that 2c3, to try and bore you to death. So if you want a free, short and sweet course, there is one by a great grandmaster there to check out. So Alex Kolovich, Kingscrusher TV /free-anti-Sicilian. You'll see that in the description of these videos as well, that free course to check out. Hope you enjoyed this. Any questions, comments, please put them in the comments, and I'll try and get back to you soon on this. Great instructive stuff here, I believe. Thanks very much.